Good morning. I'm sure many of you have your hearts in Ohio right now with Pastor Phil and his family. And as you can see, most of our leadership team is also in Ohio with Pastor Phil, so it falls to me to bring the message this morning. All right. I don't know that I'm necessarily going to be preaching a sermon here, but hopefully offering you some words of exhortation and encouragement. There's a certain art, I'm told, to framing a sermon and fitting it into a particular time block, and that's not an art I'm practiced with, so settle in and we'll see where this takes us. But hopefully we get something from the Lord out of the things I have to talk about. Being a teacher by trade, I always open with a question, so let me say, what comes to your mind when you hear the word race? Yeah, that's usually what happens when I open a question in my classroom, too. Right? Yeah. The word has a lot of meanings and a lot of contexts, and this time of year we might be thinking about campaigns for political office, but we're focusing on the more traditional use of this as a contest of speed. Right? You get into a race and you see who can get from point A to point B the fastest. Right? How many of you are runners or cyclists or engage in that kind of competitive activity? I see one hand right now. This is where I wish Phil and his children were around. They run, right? Has anyone ever participated in a race? Okay, interesting. More of you have done that than are runners. Interesting. All right. I imagine more of you have participated in a race than you think about. The rat race is a well-known activity that many people undertake in the world of business, which is basically running in circles and feeling like you're getting nowhere. But some people probably feel like their entire life is something of a race. Always rushing about, barely have a chance to catch your breath. Right? Some of you might feel like your personal, professional life is in that vein. Hopefully not your spiritual life. I don't know that the Apostle Paul was a runner, but he certainly seemed to find the metaphor of running in a race something that was very compelling for discussing the Christian life. He makes use of it in 4 or 5 of his epistles, and it seems to be a default verb for him when he talks about doing the work of the Lord. So I want us to take a look at some of those racing images in Paul's epistles this morning, looking at the Christian life and the metaphor of running a race. And I'd like to begin this morning in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 24. Verse 24 reads, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it." Now, I don't know if I've stopped to think about this before, but I'm prepping a message on this. I suddenly realized, wait a minute, is that what's going on here? Are we all competing with each other and only one of us is going to make it to the end? If Dennis wins the heavenly race, are all of the rest of us left out on the sidelines? Certainly Jesus makes it clear that the path to destruction is wide and the path to salvation is narrow and few find it. But I don't think that's the racing metaphor that Paul's trying to draw here. All right? And I think that if we take this as one statement rather than two, all right, all run but one receives the prize, is followed with run in such a way that you may obtain it. And I think that's the direction Paul wants us to look at. What does it take to run in such a way that you are able to win the race, to attain the prize? Right? Because if you think about racing, it is interesting as a sport in this particular regard, that in many sports, think about wrestling or basketball or soccer, right? You face off against an opponent, right? And your tactics are a combination of trying to gain advantage for yourself and trying to disadvantage your opponent and to overcome an opposition. You play defense as well as offense. But when it comes to running a race, it doesn't work that way, right? Once you get onto the racetrack and you settle into the starting block, there's really nothing you do to affect how the people on either side of you are going to run, right? You can't slow them down. You can't interfere with their progress. They're going to run how they run. And the only thing under your control as a racer is for you to try to proceed down the course as fast as you can and do everything in your power to go as fast and as far as you are able to do. And so if we take that as our image, right, the idea of one receiving the prize is simply there as the understanding of the motivation of we have to compete with everything we have in order to be the one that reaches the finish line first. I did a lot of running when I was younger, and most of the time without any competitors. I just go out and run. And that didn't really interfere with me making it into a contest and competing because I had a clock and I could look and see how long it took me to run and compare that to yesterday's race. And that was plenty competitive to keep me motivated in my running. And I think that's the image here of what can we do to improve our time, to get faster, to be better prepared to run the race. So, what does that look like? What needs to happen? How do you prepare in order to win a race? Well, given the metaphor, I did a little research. I looked up how the world's best runners and racers prepare and what they do to train and be ready to run at world-class times. And there are a lot of consistent things they do in order to be at the top of the world's racing. One of the things was start young. It was probably a little late for most of us, but we can take that as don't put off preparing. Start training now. Right? They warm up properly before they train, and then they train multiple times a day, often for several hours at a time. There's training in the morning and training in the afternoon, and effort throughout the day towards being ready to race. Interestingly, most of the world's best athletes train 6 days a week and then take 1 day off. I wonder where they got that idea from. Right? But they suggested that more time off, taking breaks from your training habits, limits your progress, sets you back, and even increases the risk of injury. They say once you start, you need to be relentless in continuing the undertaking. Daily commitment is essential. Best athletes train regularly and compete regularly against others in their sport. They say this provides encouragement, it helps them develop skills, it gives them accountability. They maintain healthy eating habits. They have to eat enough food to give them the strength to finish their race, but they also have a carefully chosen diet designed to provide them the kind of energy they need for whatever race they're running. Sprinters eat differently than distance runners, and what they eat is very important. And they work to stay hydrated throughout the day, not just before and during the race. It's considered critical to keep a consistent sleep schedule. Make sure you get 8 to 10 hours of sleep every night so your body could recover from the training and be at its best. And being consistent helped get good rest. And otherwise you stall, you get hurt. Right? And all the top athletes are intentional, maintaining their mental health and their focus. Right? So by now you're saying, what's all this have to do with church on Sunday? Why is Dave up there talking about sports? Right? But Paul's using this image as an illustration for us, so let's pose the question, how many of us are setting about our spiritual lives or our professional and personal lives with the level of dedication that approaches what we see in the training to be a world-class runner? Because I think that's what Paul is setting up here, right? Are we taking the kingdom work as seriously as an athlete takes running their race? Because this is a commitment that spans all day, every aspect of one's life to be ready to win a race. Right? And so reading on after this verse, what does Paul say? Everyone who competes for the prize is temperate, exercises self-control in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Seems that Paul's vision for the church here is not a leisurely stroll down the beach with Jesus and stopping to gather shells and take in the scenery. Right? Paul is giving a call here for us to commit to a grueling, life-altering discipline of a sort we can undertake for ourselves and compete with ourselves, but which is absolutely essential to achieve success in the spiritual arena. Right? That seems to be the call, and it's, I think, worthy of us to reflect. Is that the way we're taking? Are we undertaking the life of Christ the way a sprinter undertakes their race? Are we preparing to be able to win this race? So unpacking this, I've got four characteristics that go into being successful in a race that I think we'll take a look at and see how they apply. This is the first that we've been addressing, a total lifestyle commitment to the training. Right? The training of a sprinter or a distance runner involves ordering and arranging every aspect of their lives towards the discipline of developing their ability and becoming the fastest that they can be. Right? Are we giving that discipline to our undertaking to become as Christ-like as we can be? Right? Scripture gives us instructions such as bring every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. Sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. The words of Jesus, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. And I don't think the words daily and always here are hyperbole. I think the intention speaks to what Paul is showing us with this metaphor of athletes, right, is this day in, day out, relentless dedication to the pursuit of the goal, which for us would be to be like Christ. Right? You know, it's probably not possible in the racing world to guarantee that you're going to win a race, but there are a whole lot of things you can do to guarantee that you won't win the race. Right? Not being prepared, not doing your best, not being ready to run. Right? And that, at least being under our control, would be the things that Paul is warning us about, not to be complacent in our pursuit of Christ. Second lesson would be that in order to win the race, you have to play by the rules. Going on in 1 Corinthians, Paul mentions there not being disqualified. He trains and prepares so that he won't be disqualified. In 2 Timothy 2, beginning in verse 3, Paul is using racing imagery again, making the same point. He tells Timothy, you must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No one engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. And also, if anyone competes in athletics, he is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. Most of you have probably heard of the Tour de France. It's the world's oldest and most prestigious bicycling race. If you're only passingly familiar with it, that's likely because you've heard of how many scandals have plagued this particular event. Right? By now, there are several years from the early 2000s where the Tour de France does not even have a recognized winner, because every competitor at the top of the sport those years has since been disqualified for cheating and removed from the race. Right? All of the races of note in the world have rules, things you're not allowed to do, and being caught doing them disqualifies you. Even if you seem to have won, that can be taken away from you. Right? What's that? How does that work in our metaphor here? What is Paul talking about? What are the rules that Paul is suggesting we have to run under? Well, if we keep going in 1 Corinthians on into chapter 10, Paul's next words, I think, address that. It's a long section, but bear with me. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. They're all going about the same things, but with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And he gives a list of the things that proved to be displeasing. Well, actually, first he says these things became our examples, to the extent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Do not become idolaters, as were some of them. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, nor let us tempt Christ. All these things happened to them as examples. They were written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the ages has come. I skipped over some bits there to hit the highlights, but each one of these things he calls out, God brings judgment. Those people are disqualified. And Paul says these are examples to us that we should not follow after these paths, right? Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. So we have a nice catalog of things that will disqualify us from our race. A positive side of this could be found in another racing passage in Philippians chapter 2. Beginning in verse 12 there, Paul tells us what is to do to be qualified. All right, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ. And here he is with his running measure, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. What makes this race of Paul's and this discipline successful here? If we look back at the verbs of this passage, right? Being blameless, children of God, without fault. Keeping ourselves from sin so that we shine as lights. Holding fast to God's words of life. So we have our rule book, as it were, consisting of all the commands of God. Right? These you shall do. If you do not, this will happen. Right? All the way back to the beginning, right? One of the first rules of the race would come from the testimony of Jesus. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That is not the most popular viewpoint. We talked in Sunday school this morning about people trying to check all the boxes and cover as many religions as they can to make sure they're in good shape. And Jesus says there is only one. Right? And yet people try to reach the end of the race by other means. Right? John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, classic allegory, he has this as an example in his story. Right? Our primary character, Pilgrim, the Christian, is making his way along the heavenly road towards salvation, encountering struggles along the way. He has companions, faithful and hopeful, and partway down the road, along comes a fellow by the name of Ignorance, who just jumps on the highway in the middle and joins them. And Ignorance travels with them, and he goes through the same challenges they do, and he faces the same obstacles, and he helps them overcome, and he discourses with Christian and with hopeful and very erudite and theologically sound manner, except that they point out to him that he isn't on the highway the right way, that to be on the highway you have to go in through the narrow gate at the beginning. Have your passport. Right? Doesn't seem to bother Ignorance, and nothing seems to come of it until near the end of the story when they reach the celestial city, and Pilgrim and Hopeful are let into the city because they have their passport, and Ignorance is turned aside and disallowed entrance. He is disqualified from his undertaking because he didn't follow the rules. Right? I'm going to suggest that there are many people today who are trying in this fashion to cheat their way into heaven. Right? They are probably acting the part, and they probably look to us as if they're worthy competitors racing alongside us. Right? Yet somewhere at heart they are deceivers, hiding disqualifying behaviors behind a facade of holiness. And while it seems to be possible, at least for a time, to fool an Olympic committee or a sports tribunal, right, we serve a God who seeks out and searches the inner recesses of the heart. And there is no fooling God. And so Jesus warns on the day of judgment, many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, done many wonders in your name? Have we not run down all of these portions of the race? And Jesus will say, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice wickedness. Right? So we prepare ourselves, we train, we devote our discipline to the pursuit of heaven, and we avoid. We eschew, we flee from anything that would disqualify us, recognizing the danger there in not competing according to the rules. And what does that look like, right? Part of our commitment to the discipline of Christ is starting from the beginning and pursuing Christ with an unwavering commitment. And I think that involves the complete and total surrender of will to Christ's lordship. That's the way that we achieve this becoming blameless and not being disqualified. It is a daily undertaking. Right? Perhaps related, third principle is part of following rules, but in a race there are no shortcuts. Right? Everyone is expected to follow the path that is marked out for the race and turn neither to the left nor the right. Right? In fact, a lot of marathons are laid out in such a way that you start somewhere and the course makes its way through all of the parts of the city where it's being run. It shows off the city's neighborhoods and features and sites, and a lot of times these end up practically right back where they started. Right? But the participants are not expected, as soon as the starting gun sounds, to just make a beeline for the finish and be done. They have to follow the path marked out for them. Right? When it comes to our spiritual race, the Lord has laid out the path for each of us in the same fashion. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. As we run the race of the Lord, the race is the one he lays before us, not the direction we might feel like running. Right? Sometimes the path may go up steep hills. It may go through dark valleys. It may go into unfamiliar or even dangerous neighborhoods. Right? But we are assured that God is with us, protecting us as we follow the path, and ultimately there is no other path that leads to the completion of the race. Wherever that path goes, if you want to end the race successfully, you will follow that path. Right? No shortcuts. Moving along briskly, this is my fourth and final point. Right? There is a principle here as we race to rely on others, to rely on those around us, to rely on Christ. Right? Many runners in longer races have a team supporting them, providing them with water, nutrition, encouragement as they proceed along the course. Right? We've already seen how the best runners in the world train with each other and support and encourage each other in the discipline of becoming better at their sport and accountability. We see Paul following that in yet another of his uses of running as an image. Galatians 2. I went up by revelation and communicated to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, privately to those who were of reputation, lest by any means I might run or had run in vain. Not sure we know what he means by run here if we just started here, but in the context of these other verses, it seems to be a theme of Paul's, this idea of life as a race. And what's he doing? This is after his conversion on the Damascus Road when he'd been persecuting the church. He's become a follower of Christ. He's been preaching amongst the Gentiles. This is before he goes on his full-fledged missionary travels where he's commissioned and sent out. And we see a quiet moment in Paul's time where he goes up to Jerusalem to talk to the apostles and check himself. Make sure that he is on the right path, that he's teaching the right things. That, as he says, to make sure that I might run, that lest by any means I might run or had run in vain. Paul feels the need to have that support, confirm that he's on the right path, make sure that he's following the rules. Right? As runners on the path here, right, we should be attentive to the same thing, right? We should be careful when we forsake the spiritual discipline of fellowship, the discerning correction and instruction of spiritual authorities, right? Without the help of those who can guide us, right, we increase the chance of straying off the path and missing the finish of the race. So the scripture enjoins us in Hebrews chapter 10 leading towards another running image, by the way. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. Again, note the discipline, holding fast without wavering. Right? For he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and more as you see the day approaching. Right? Suggests that we have a duty to each other to keep speaking the message, keep bringing words of encouragement and exhortation, to bring words of warning. Right? When was the last time you turned to one of your fellow runners of Christian faith and commended them for their dedication and commitment? Looked at a fellow believer who is serving as an example to you and let them know the blessing they're providing. Right? To encourage those who are flagging to keep going, to press on, right? To redirect those who missed a turn, get them back on the race course. Right? A few verses later, the writer of Hebrews again turns to racing and running as an image. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising its shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So Jesus provides us one example, the one we look to. We're also surrounded by others who are able to watch us and strengthen us in encouragement, servant examples, right? The cloud of witnesses, and we're enjoined to the discipline again of putting aside anything and everything that gets in the way of our pursuit of the heavenly race. Made easier in this case because of these witnesses supporting us. Right? Pretty much every sport I'm aware of where the matter has been studied manifests something called home field advantage. Right? It's pretty much undeniable that having a crowd of cheering admirers urging a competitor on or urging a team onward inspires feats of athletic prowess that are not reachable by those same competitors on their own, by themselves. Right? Some of the great races in history have ended with runners at the end of their strength barely staggering into the stadium, but when you hear the crowd in the stadium as they see them enter and begin cheering them on, there's a burst of final speed they put on as they head for the finish line. Right? They were completely exhausted, but they find something extra when the crowd roars and pumps them up, right? And I think we're being asked to be that for each other. Right? We opened the dissection of this metaphor here, pointing out how in racing there's no defense. We don't do anything to slow down the competitors on either side of us, right? But we have kind of the opposite view here, right? We can, in fact, we ought urge our fellow runners on. Right? We can help those around us move forward. Right? If that's still a race, then I suppose it suggests we're all running on the same team. Right? We make a difference in one another's ability to successfully complete our runs, and that's part of our duty, I think, in the Christian race, is to urge on the rest of us who are running alongside. I don't think Paul's setting this up as a competition between us. I think he's setting each of us up as having our race to run as part of the same team. Right? Remember that while it sometimes might seem impossible to maintain this level of dedication, right? These great runners of the world probably aren't perfect in hitting their training every day and getting to sleep on time, right? But we have an advantage there, right? Jesus himself went as an example, and God gives us the necessary strength. The Philippians passage that we read earlier, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Right? We have a source of limitless strength if we are to exercise the discipline of tapping into it. Going to wrap things up here on something of a triumphant note. There's one more passage that Paul draws on with this racing image. Right? God has seen fit to give us Paul as a witness of a spiritual runner. Let us see what that discipline looks like in his life, and God also gives us a window into the victorious end of the Apostle Paul's race. All right, 2 Timothy again, chapter 4. This is most likely the last epistle Paul writes before he is martyred for his faith. And he's writing to one of his closest friends and followers in Timothy. And here at the end of his life, he is able to say, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And then we get a little glimpse beyond the finish line. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. And not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing. The runners in Paul's athletic metaphor, remember, were running to receive a perishable crown. You win the race, you get the laurel leaves, you're crowned as a victor of that race. And Paul says we're running for an imperishable crown, and here we see Paul receiving that at the end of his race. And the hope, we will close on this note, to us as fellow aspiring runners of the heavenly race, the crown is awarded not to Paul only, but as the scripture says, to all who have loved his appearing. Right? My prayer for all of us here is that we will do what we must so that we find ourselves among that number when our race comes to an end, and we are all receiving the crown of righteousness that is laid up for us as we can say, we have finished our race. Ask Dennis to give a closing prayer, and then you are dismissed.